Welcome to today's session. Today I want to talk about our battle against infectious disease over the last 150 years. I've called this session Paradise Delayed because despite what many of us believe, that we've actually won the battle against infectious diseases and brought them all under control, nothing could be further from the truth. Let's take a step back to begin. There's little doubt that one of the most dramatic developments in our health during the last 150 years has been the largely successful conquest of infectious disease. Less than 70 years ago, diseases like TB, typhoid, diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, pneumonia, and a variety of enteric infections constituted a major public health problem, particularly for young children, while epidemic outbreaks of diseases like smallpox, plague, and influenza could in fact paralyse whole nations and cause tremendous suffering. The first steps in the conquest of infectious disease depended upon our growing realisation of the link between unsanitary environmental conditions and disease prevalence. The second phase occurred some decades later when rising standards of living, pharmaceutical innovations, modern anaesthetics, X-rays, sulfonamides, improved surgical techniques, and then in the 1940s and 1950s, the discovery of penicillin and other antibiotics combined to force down mortality rates and to lessen the threat of infectious disease. There's no doubt that the advent of antibiotics radically changed the clinical picture of many infections. Pneumonia and bronchitis, for example, ceased to be killers of children and young adults and simply became a complication in the course of chronic illnesses like heart disease and emphysema. By the end of the first half of the 20th century, this revolution in public health had all but run its course. By the early 1950s, people living in countries like Australia enjoyed high levels of sanitation, personal hygiene and nutrition, and possessed higher living standards as reasonable access to good and sophisticated medical care systems. While changes in the environment clearly played an important role in the decline of infectious disease, there was also important changes in the host-disease-agent relationship. It seems more than likely that many infectious pathogens underwent a change in infectivity and virulence during the late part of the 19th century and the earlier 20th century. In addition, changes in the human environment, particularly nutritional changes, undoubtedly increased human resistance to many of the more common infections, as well as increasing the incidence of many non-infectious diseases, such as coronary heart disease and a variety of cancers. Infectious disease, once primarily the scourge of young children, had by the 1950s largely become the domain of the elderly, the chronically ill, and the immunologically compromised. Whatever the causative mechanisms involved, many countries, like Australia, were said to have entered a new phase of demographic and epidemiological development, where mortality was very low, particularly among the young, and where explosive epidemics of infectious disease have become a thing of the past. How much we've changed. By the 1950s, the broad changes that took place in many societies with respect to the patterns of disease and the ageing of populations had directed our attention away from the biophysical environment and infectious disease towards consideration of the relevance of the social environment for health, particularly the role of man-made toxicants, noxious social conditions, and unhealthy lifestyles. It remains paradoxical, however, that despite the biological, medical, socio-economic and demographic changes that have taken place, many infectious diseases have not disappeared, but remain widespread in societies like Australia, and for particular social groups continue to constitute an important threat to our public health. Part of this, I think, is the way we see infectious disease. Australia is a good example. We tend to react if it threatens our lives or kills us. We tend to behave in a way that we try and do something significantly about it, find a new cure, find a new antibiotic or whatever. If a disease doesn't threaten our lives, but simply makes us ill for a little while, we tend to shrug our shoulders and say, we'll live with it. In Australia, dengue is a classic example of this. Dengue outbreaks have been around Australia since the 1870s. Some of these have been extraordinary epidemics, but because dengue doesn't kill many of us, just makes us ill for a little while and compromises our lifestyle, we've tended to shrug our shoulders. We should have had a cure for dengue a century ago, but we've shrugged and moved on. Dengue epidemics have been a critical part of Australia's life and history. Look at the outbreak in 1925-26, where dengue spread down the whole of the eastern seaboard of Australia, almost to Sydney. There was something of the order of 560,000 cases of dengue in 1925-26, one of the greatest vector-borne, mosquito-borne epidemics in Australian history. Many of the towns in northern Queensland, in central Queensland and northern New South Wales, something of the order of 60 to 70% of the population had dengue. There were relatively few deaths, and people shrugged and lived with it and moved on. I guess while it's true that the incidence of many common infections have declined significantly since the 1920s, and that infectious disease causes relatively few deaths today, the fact remains that infections are an important cause of our ill health, and despite the availability of effective treatments, remain inadequately controlled. Many older infections have persisted, particularly among the more disadvantaged sectors of our population. This is particularly the case of a whole range of infections, but also childhood infections have reared their head again. Outbreaks of measles, chickenpox, mumps, diphtheria, all diseases which should have disappeared decades ago have reappeared, partly because of our behaviour and how we regarded what we should do to confront disease. The emergence and/or survival of many infectious agents in the late 20th century has been facilitated by three broad factors. Firstly, there's no doubt that pathogens or disease agents have undergone changes themselves. This is perhaps best seen with influenza, where every year a new strain of the disease emerges. It tells us something about the infectious diseases that we confront. Many of them are changing radically. We are not the dominant species in this world. The microbial world is, but I'll have more to say about it in a moment. In the second place, changes in human behaviour, such as mobility, the advent of air travel, changes in living and working conditions have undoubtedly contributed to the spread of many infections. Crowded living and working and travel conditions, together with the maintenance of artificially controlled interior climates, have facilitated the spread of many diseases. There's no doubt that changes in our lifestyle and health behaviour have generally made it far easier for older infections to persist and for new viral infections to spread. Coronavirus is a perfect example. My mind goes back to 1969, when the US Surgeon General proudly announced to an American nation that infectious diseases had been conquered, and for the first time we could now move on and address a range of important chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease and the like that were confronting society. In fact, as many of us indulge visions of a new antiseptic age, new infections were already appearing. Interestingly, most of these major outbreaks occurred in Africa and Asia, but with our narrow ethnocentric vision, we conveniently overlooked them. But then in the 1970s, a whole range of new infections struck with tremendous impact and visibility, and our complacency was dashed forever. Looking back on the 1950s, there were plenty of signposts of emerging infections. West Nile virus burst forth in Israel in a series of major epidemics in the early 1950s. Korean hemorrhagic fever appeared in 1951, a classic example of war and population movements disrupting a natural disease environment. Dengue hemorrhagic fever emerged a few years later, Junin virus in Argentina, and so it goes on. Generally, though, we just shrugged our shoulders and said most of these outbreaks would burn themselves out in the third world and we could get on with our lives. It wasn't really until about the late 1960s when a particularly virulent hemorrhagic fever broke out in Zaire and the Sudan, only to receive headlines when it affected 31 workers in a research laboratory in Marburg, Germany, killing 7 of them, that our attention was suddenly recaptured. The next 4 decades, as you may well remember, witnessed an endless parade of new infections, from La Crosse encephalitis, Lassa fever, Hantan virus, Lyme disease, major outbreaks of Ebola, Legionnaire's disease, toxic shock syndrome, mad cow disease, SARS, monkeypox, bird flu, and now we're confronted by coronavirus. There's little doubt that the hope of an antiseptic and infection-free age so triumphantly claimed 50 years ago has proved to be illusionary. Over the last 30 years or so, infectious disease returned to the international agenda, and so-called new infections have triggered global epidemics, while older infections that we once thought we had perfectly under control have reappeared, often in more virulent forms and geographically redistributed through our world. One of the crucial messages to emerge from the emergence of infectious disease, and one we tend to overlook, is that the biophysical environment is a powerful, ever-changing force, and we have severely underestimated the role it plays in our lives and the significance, or its significance, for the respect of infectious diseases. The microbial world has revealed a dynamism that confirms the strength of evolution in the natural world. This may seem obvious to many of you. However, the optimistic assault of medicine on microbes rested on the false assumption that we were dealing with stationary targets against which we could simply level magic bullets. Western medicine has rested on this belief for a very long time, and we've tended to see ourselves as the centre of the universe, which almost by accident contained disease agents. The imagery when confronting outbreaks of infectious disease was invariably one of a battlefield, with the disease agents being described by us as invasive, life-threatening, a new assault. Our response was equally couched in military terms: a battle against new infections, the need to mobilise health resources, to assemble a new array of weapons to confront disease. There is, however, an alternative view, one which sees us, humans, as just one of a series of competing species in the world, where many processes are cyclical or waxing and waning and evolving. To me, there seems little doubt that our anthropocentric quest to eradicate or control all infectious diseases is utopian. Microbes, like all living things, have been selected for survival. And the emergence of infectious disease, particularly over the last 30 or so years, underscores the reality of mutation and change in infectious disease, that microbes can change according to their environment, according to their host's environment, and that human survival often reflects a delicate and often fragile balance between people, animals, and the microbial world. let me say that almost 70, perhaps more than 70% of all infectious diseases that affect us are zoonotic. That is, they originate in animals. It's always remained curious to me why a country like Australia has two health systems, one for people and one for animals, when the link between animals hosting pathogens and infectious diseases which ultimately move to affect us is without doubt. Ironically, many of the forces that contribute to the emergence of infectious diseases are the product of our behaviour. There's little doubt that we have underestimated the complexity of our environment and the capacity of microbial species to adapt and evolve, and that we've placed far too much reliance on the intervention of things like antibacterial drugs, pesticides, and vaccines to free us from disease. Many, I think, would now argue that the most serious threat to our security is the destabilisation of the often fragile relationship that exists between people, animals, and the biophysical environment. Human populations and a wide variety of disease agents and their vectors, something which spread them from host to host, have co-evolved and coexisted for thousands of years. The equilibrium between humans and microbes has been honed by centuries of contact, by the development of our immune system, by social, economic, and political mores, and by human behaviour. Periodically, this delicate relationship could easily be disturbed, either by environmental change, such as a natural disaster, by us intruding on the biophysical environment, whether it's building dams or developing forests or developing agriculture, thus intruding on natural reservoirs of infection, where disease has been rampant perhaps for centuries. There are a whole range of critical conditions re-emerging infectious disease. One, that disease emergence is a complex process, often requiring a number of factors to change sequentially or simultaneously. Two, infectious diseases are dynamic and often preserve complex ecologies involving the interplay of a disease agent, vectors, something which spread it, primary and secondary hosts, and natural reservoirs. Three, most of the so-called new infections, or what we call new infections, are not actually new. Many are in fact zoonoses, or animal infections, that have been present in our environment perhaps for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, circulating quite comfortably among their animal hosts, rarely affecting us until perhaps somehow we disturb their natural environment by some aspect of our behaviour or by environmental change. More than 1,500 species of infectious organisms are known to be pathogenic to us, and probably about 70% of these are zoonotic or animal infections. Fourthly, human behaviour and agency, as I've said, are the most potent factors in the emergence and spread of infectious disease. We live in a world without borders. Not only do we move around the world, but infectious diseases move as well. They recognise no international borders at all. And many of us travel. Hundreds of millions of people now travel by air in times of travel that are far less than the incubation period of infectious disease. Add that to the fact that more and more people are holidaying in remote areas of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and somehow often become exposed to an infectious disease. They then board the plane and fly home. Rarely do they show any signs or symptoms of the infection until well after returning home. We live in a very mobile world, and infectious diseases like us no longer recognise international borders and spread with ease. Coronavirus gives a perfect example how easily a major infection can spread around the world. The history of infectious disease has been the history of microorganisms on the march, often in our wake, and of microbes quick to take advantage of the many rich opportunities offered by our behaviour to allow them to thrive, prosper and spread. The historical processes have given rise to the emergence and spread of infectious disease continue today with unrelenting force and are in fact accelerating because of the conditions of 21st century life, particularly, as I've just said, the speed, volume and global reach of international travel, plus the way we've continued to modify our biophysical environment. All this has ensured their proliferation and spread. Critically, we continue to underestimate the importance of the biophysical environment and the fact that animal and human disease are closely allied. It is quite surprising how easily we are panicked by the threat of epidemic disease and how quickly we forget the past. As Freud said almost 100 years ago, quote, "Contemporary man, living in a scientific age in which epidemic disease is understood and to a large extent controlled, is apt to lose appreciation of the enormous population losses in past generations and of the prolonged, widespread psychosocial and emotional strain produced by such disasters." An apt comment in these times of growing concern over coronavirus and future pandemics of influenza. In my next session, I'll be talking about exactly what are epidemics and pandemics, how they spread around the world, how they influence our life, what have been the major outbreaks of pandemics over the world over the last couple of hundred years, and what we can look forward to in our future.